This is a lecture on Ecclesiastes, a book that deals with questions of skepticism and faith. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle. First of all, the authorship question: who wrote Ecclesiastes? And there's three views that I want to mention. One is the traditional view. The traditional view is that Solomon wrote the book. The critical view is that Solomon didn't write the book, but a man who is labeled Kohelet writes as if he were Solomon. And then a view that's neither one or the other of those is the alternative view. The narrator quotes Kohelet, who may or may not be Solomon. So you have two authors, the narrator and Kohelet and/or Solomon. The traditional view explained: the speaker calls himself the son of David, king over Jerusalem in chapter 1 and verse 1, and similar statement in chapter 1 and verse 12. And thus he appears to be a king of Judah. Solomon was known for wisdom, and this is a wisdom book, so that would make sense. And he says in verse 16 that he was wiser than all before me in Jerusalem. Those words could only apply to Solomon. The critical view is that the author is Kohelet, who takes on the persona of Solomon as a literary guise. The beginning of the book says that the author is someone labeled Kohelet. And if you translate it, that would be the preacher is in the King James Version, or the teacher in the NIV. Kohelet is a participle that means she who assembles, which is a little strange, the feminine. Why does the author give himself this strange title? And why doesn't he mention his own real name if Solomon is the author? The critical view says, well, maybe this is the author's way of saying, well, I'm not really Solomon, but I'm writing as if I were. I'm saying what Solomon would have said if he were still around. It says in verse 16, I've acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And this expression that he was wiser than all who ruled before him in Jerusalem is a little bit odd for Solomon, since the only Judean king that ruled before him in Jerusalem was David. It seems like he's saying, if you take this at face value, well, I was smarter than my dad. Whereas if he's writing well into the monarchy, he could use that language a little more easily than Solomon himself could have. That perhaps betrays that this is a literary guise, so the critical view says. The alternative view points out that there's a narrator who is distinct from Kohelet. There's at least two authors, the narrator and Kohelet Solomon. Note the third person in chapter 7 and verse 27 and chapter 12, 9 through 10. 7:27, behold, I've discovered this, says the preacher. That's the narrator speaking, adding one thing to another to find explanation. And then in the epilogue to the book in chapter 12, in addition to being a wise man, the preacher, and that's Kohelet, also taught the people knowledge. And he pondered, searched out, and arranged many proverbs. Kohelet sought to find delightful words and to write words of truth correctly. This is someone talking about the preacher or Kohelet. Also in chapter 8, in verses 2 through 8, he speaks of the Davidic office as if he were an outsider. So he says, obey the king's command, I say, because you took an oath before God. Well, obey the king's command, I say. Why doesn't he say, obey my command as king, if it's Solomon that's speaking? Hence, even if Kohelet is Solomon, and there's a good case to be made that he is Solomon, the narrator is not Kohelet, but some later author who arranged Kohelet's words and wrote an epilogue to the book that contains the words of Kohelet. The message of Ecclesiastes deals with the problem of skepticism and faith. And one of the key expressions to help us understand the book of Ecclesiastes is the expression under the sun, which occurs in chapter 1 and verse 9 and other places. He looks at life under the sun, and I think what the meaning of that is, he's looking life from a human perspective apart from God. So if you look at it from a human perspective, apart from God, that leaves God out, you're going to conclude that life is meaningless, absurd, and empty. But the end of the book is going to say, don't look at it that way. The narrator concludes in 12, 13, and 14 that instead one must fear God and keep his commandments. And if you do that, then life does become meaningful. But this is in contrast to the perspective of looking at life under the sun of most of the book. The bottom line is that the book must be read in the light of its conclusion. So the conclusion is you need to fear God and keep his commandments. The rest of the book must be read consistent with the conclusion. If you outline the book of Ecclesiastes, you have chapters 1 through 6 that talks about life under the sun, that is, life apart from God, is all vanity of vanities. And then chapters 7 through 12, it makes the cheery point that death is better than life. So let's look at chapters 1 through 6, life under the sun, that apart from God, all is vanity of vanities. Chapter 1, verses 2 through 11. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utter meaninglessness. Everything is meaningless. What does a man gain from all his labor at which he toils under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow to the sea, and yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear is full of hearing. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, this is something new. It was here already long ago. It was here before our time. There is no remembrance of men of old. Even those who are yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow. Here he sees life as meaningless, or vanity of vanities, if you do a different translation. Life is an endless, purposeless cycle where one day goes, another day comes. Sun rises, sun sets. Streams continue to flow, and it's just an endless cycle that never has any ultimate accomplishment. Now, human wisdom also, he says, provides no true satisfaction. Verse 13, I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. What a heavy burden God has laid on men. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is twisted cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I thought to myself, look, I have grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind, for with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. You might think that wisdom would give satisfaction to life. But as he studied the world using his wisdom and his knowledge, he came to that conclusion that life is empty. The more he understood the world, the more he understood it was full of madness and folly. The more you know, the more it hurts. With much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. He also concludes that pleasure and work provide no true satisfaction in chapter 2. I thought in my heart, "Come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good." But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is foolish. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly. My mind was still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few years of their lives. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired men and women singers and a harem as well, the delights of the heart of man. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was my reward for all my labor. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Neither pleasure nor work provided any true satisfaction in life. And then there are oppressive cycles of time. And here you have a passage that there's a time for this and a time for that, and some see that as a positive thing. But if you look at the conclusion, it looks like he sees it as oppressive cycles. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones, a time to gather them, a time to embrace, a time to refrain, a time to search and a time to give up searching, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What does a worker gain from all his toil? I have seen the burden that God has laid on men. There are times for this, that, and the other things, and you're forced into behaving according to what the time allows you to. But it's all oppressive. It's a burden that God has laid on men. He looks at men themselves and he finds them to be very beastly. I also thought, as for men, God tests them so that they may know that they are like the animals, or they are beast, as the New American Standard puts it. He also looks around and sees how people get away with injustice. Again, I looked and saw the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. And I declared that the dead who have already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not been, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. And I saw that all labor and all achievement spring from man's envy of his neighbor. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. In chapter 5, he mentions that money never satisfies. One of the problems is it causes us to worry over keeping it. Verse 10 of chapter 5, whoever loves money never has money enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. This too is meaningless. As goods increase, so do those who consume them, and what benefit are they to the owner except to feast his eyes on them? The sleep of a laborer is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of a rich man permits him no sleep. If you have money, you worry about it. You worry that maybe the stock market will crash and you'll lose it all. And then wealth is all lost at death or misfortune. I've seen a grievous evil under the sun, wealth hoarded to the harm of its owner, or wealth lost through some misfortune, so that when he has a son, there's nothing left for him. Naked a man comes from his mother's womb, and as he comes, so he departs. He takes nothing from his labor that he can carry in his hand. This too is a grievous evil. As a man comes, so he departs. And what does he gain except he toils for the wind? And then chapter 6 and verse 2, God gives a man wealth, possessions, and honor, so that he lacks nothing his heart's desires, but God does not enable him to enjoy them, and a stranger enjoys them instead. This is meaningless, a grievous evil. As they say, you can't take it with you. You may accumulate great wealth, but when you die, you lose it all. Or you may have wealth, and some catastrophe happens, and the wealth is lost through some misfortune, so that when you die, you don't even have any money to pass on to your children. And then you may have the wealth, but wealth doesn't buy happiness. It doesn't necessarily mean you enjoy it. Now, one of the questions that comes up with Ecclesiastes is, does this book affirm an afterlife? This is a debated issue. In chapter 3 and verse 11, it might hint at an afterlife. The NIV puts it, He has made everything beautiful in His time. He has also set eternity in the hearts of men. And this eternity in the hearts of men could refer to a longing for heaven and heaven's eternal God. On the other hand, the New Revised Standard Version gives a rather different interpretation that doesn't imply any affirmation of afterlife. He has made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, He has put a sense of past and future into their minds. Well, having a sense of past and future is a very different connotation than eternity, and doesn't necessarily imply anything about an afterlife. And then there's Ecclesiastes 3:21, where Kohelet expresses doubts about the afterlife. Who knows that the breath of man ascends upward, and the breath of the beast descends downward to the earth? How do you know that people die and they go to heaven, but animals die and they just go back down to the earth? And then there's 6:12. For who knows what is good for a man during his lifetime, during the few years of his life? He will spend them like a shadow, for who can tell a man what will be after him under the sun? And here again, it seems to be expressing some doubt. You have the few years of this futile life, but then Who can tell a man what will be after him? If you look at life under the sun, that is, apart from God, no one can say whether there's anything after him. Does Ecclesiastes affirm an afterlife? Well, the writer of Ecclesiastes is speaking from a human-only perspective, looking at life under the sun. And on that basis, he can't affirm it. All he can say is, who knows? And indeed, apart from divine revelation, no one could really know whether or not there is anything beyond life for a human being. Ecclesiastes 7 through 12 has the theme, death is better than life. But the positive part is that here he's groping towards an answer to the vanity of life. He says a good funeral is better than a good party in chapter 7. Verse 2, it is better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting, for death is the destiny of every man. The living should take this to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, because a sad face is good for the heart. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure. He says a good funeral is better than a party. Why? Because it makes people think more. On the other hand, he does conclude that wisdom is better than folly, even though it isn't always rewarded. Chapter 7 and verse 5, it's better to heed a wise man's rebuke than to listen to the song of fools. And yet righteousness and wisdom are not always rewarded. 7:15, in this meaningless life of mine, I have seen both of these, a righteous man perishing in his righteousness, and a wicked man living long in his wickedness. Do not be over-righteous, neither be over-wise. Why destroy yourself? Do not be over-wicked, and do not be a fool. Why die before your time? Being righteous in this life doesn't always end up being rewarded. You may die young. And wicked people sometimes live out long and full lives. He goes on to say that you should enjoy life, but remember that God will judge us. Chapter 11 and verse 9, be happy, young man, while you are young, and let your heart give you joy in the days of your youth. Follow the ways of your heart and whatever your eyes see. But know that for all these things, God will bring you to judgment. So enjoy life, but be careful. He also tells people to remember God while they're young, while they still can. Remember your Creator, this is chapter 12 and verse 1. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come, and the years approach when you say, I find no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the moon and the stars grow dark, and the clouds return after the rain, and those looking through the windows grow dim. What's he talking about here? He's talking about when you get old and you can't see so well anymore, so that the sun and the moon and the stars grow dark. And even when the clouds leave after the rain, they're still there for you because you are growing dim in how you see. Do this before the time when the keepers of the house tremble and strong men stoop. You may be a strong young man now, but one day you'll be closer to this guy. When the grinders cease because they are few, that is, you've lost your teeth. When the doors to the street are closed and the sound of the grinding fades, when men rise at the sound of the birds, but their songs grow faint, it's when you can't hear anymore. When men are afraid of heights and of dangers in the streets. And so it's important to remember God while you can. Remember God while you're young. When you get old, it may be too late. You may be too old and feeble to appreciate what God is. And that brings us to the conclusion in chapter 12. The narrator says, not only was Kohelet wise, but he also imparted knowledge to the people. He pondered and searched out and set in order many proverbs. Kohelet searched to find just the right words, and what he wrote was upright and true. Of making many books there is no end, and much study wearies the body. Now all this has been heard here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. So the narrator's conclusion of the book is fear God and keep his commandments. What's the value of Ecclesiastes? Well, one value is that it provides for us an apologetic for non-Christians. Kohelet rightly discerns that if understood apart from God or without God being central to life, life becomes meaningless. A lot of secular people have concluded that. They look at life and they find that life is meaningless. And that realization can be the first step in a non-Christian looking to find meaning in God. Related to that is that meaning to life is found only in God. Kohelet captures the despair of many in the modern world, but particularly the conclusion, fear God and keep his commandments, also points to the solution to the dilemma. If you want life to be meaningful, fear God and keep his commandments. And then there's a value for even Christians. There's a danger of substituting other things for God. In the end, neither work, nor pleasures, nor knowledge, or sex, in and of themselves, can provide a meaningful life. And even believers sometimes get caught up in the world and miss God's real blessings by trying to find meaning where there is no meaning to be found. Now, if you find meaning in God, then your work and your pleasures and your marriage life can all be truly meaningful. But the start of it is fearing God and keeping his commandments. Well, that's my analysis of the book of Ecclesiastes.